Silvio Dante is frequently held up as one of the best mobsters in The Sopranos, and it is easy to see why. If best means competent, disciplined, and reliably aligned with the long-term interests of this thing. He operates with a calm, stoic patience that most of his colleagues treat as a foreign language. While others sprint towards self-destruction with the enthusiasm of toddlers near an open staircase, Silvio generally keeps his emotions on a leash, speaks with measured authority, and functions as the rare figure who can give Tony advice that is both practical and, inconveniently, correct. In a world where impulsivity is practically a job requirement, he is notable precisely because he is not hot-headed, not reckless, and not visibly intoxicated by his own mythology. That steadiness is not just a personality quirk, it is his professional asset. The consigliere role demands an operator who can absorb drama without becoming it, and Silvio mostly delivers. He does not seem to chase attention, does not posture for the room, and does not treat every minor insult as a call to bloodshed. He appears to understand the game, how to play it, how to endure it, and how to survive it, at least until the narrative, like an impatient accountant, starts auditing everyone's assumptions. Even his temper, when it surfaces, usually arrives with a rationale rather than a tantrum. The notable exception is the Columbus controversy, where his usual pragmatism takes a holiday and returns replaced by something loud, reactive, and painfully earnest. It is the clearest demonstration that even the steady guy has buttons, and that this particular button is labeled Heritage Grievance, please press repeatedly. Of course, the temptation with Silvio is to confuse composure with virtue. He is not good, he is just controlled. The record is not clean, merely efficient. The most glaring example is Adriana's death, a moment that many cite as proof of his chilling professionalism. No tears, no dithering, no messy conscience bleeding into the upholstery. The counter-argument tries to introduce moral ambiguity by litigating Adriana's innocence, noting that she knew what kind of men she was around, stayed in that orbit, and understood what becoming an informant typically means in that life. It is a grim logic, but it is consistent with the show's ethic. Participation in the ecosystem comes with consequences, even when the participant is outmatched by the predators. Still, the outcome remains what it is. A woman is eliminated with the same managerial finality used to solve any operational problem. Innocent becomes a technicality, and the audience is left to decide whether the coldness is admirable competence or simply the absence of a functioning moral organ. This is where Silvio's supporters become unintentionally revealing. The praise often comes down to an implicit standard. The best mobster is the one who treats murder like paperwork. He offers Tony legitimate guidance, avoids needless theatrics, and does not let feelings disrupt the enterprise, except when they do. That is the seductive appeal of the character. He looks like the adult in the room. He is also, however, the adult in a room dedicated to predation. Calmness does not cleanse the act, it just makes it look organized. And Silvio is not the only candidate for best mobster when the criteria shift. There is a compelling case for Mikey Palmice as the true model soldier. Consistently sharp, loyal to Junior, and ruthlessly competent without needing the flamboyant menace of a Richie Aprile or the carnival sideshow chaos of a Ralph. Mikey's competence is not performative, it is procedural. He follows orders, executes without hesitation, and demonstrates a frightening clarity of purpose. He participates in major operations, including the orchestration surrounding the attempt on Tony's life, and carries out Junior's business with a kind of professional precision that makes others look like amateur dramatists. Even Tony's acknowledgement that Mikey was a tough kid lands as begrudging respect, the kind that does not translate into mercy, but does translate into urgency. Keep that one from surviving long enough to become a permanent problem. His death, gunned down while jogging, reads as both brutal and ironically mundane, the show's way of reminding viewers that even competent soldiers can be erased by timing and bullets. Had he lasted longer, the argument goes, he could have risen into a significant position within the hierarchy. Short tenure, high impact. The resume of a man whose job performance required his early termination. Mikey's appeal also includes the uncomfortable point that he can be charismatic and entertaining, which is always how these characters get away with being monsters. Provide a little wit, sprinkle in a memorable line delivery, and the audience starts grading homicide on a curve. Yet even Mikey is not immune to the classic weakness that the series assigns to nearly everyone: gambling. Unless he was gambling, functions like a footnote that explains an otherwise polished record. In this universe, vices are not just character traits, they are plot engines, ticking away until the inevitable detonation. Silvio, notably, has his own set of fault lines, just less loudly dramatized. There are observations that he could tell Tony when he was out of line, including moments when Tony's violence crossed the line even by their standards. That ability to push back, rare among the crew, adds to Silvio's aura as the rational counselor. But it also introduces the uncomfortable question: if he can recognize excess, what does it say that he continues to enable the system that produces it? Restraint becomes a style choice, not a moral boundary. Then comes the backlash, the argument that Silvio is not a realistic mobster at all, but a caricature, a stylized collection of mannerisms, wardrobe signals, and exaggerated expressions that sometimes feels less like a person and more like a walking mob movie reference. The critique is blunt: the permanent scowl, the repetitive shrugging, the hair, the suits. Everything seems tuned to snazzy gangster stereotype, as if the character was built from the most obvious components of pop mafia iconography. It is not necessarily an indictment of effort. Even defenders concede the performer did well given the writing. The issue is the tonal fit. Silvio can feel out of place, like a character imported from a broader comedy into a show that increasingly traffics in psychological realism. The counterpoint, predictably, is that the caricature is the point. These men are not the Roots and Glory Days mafia. They are a late-stage imitation, modeling themselves on The Godfather and other mob movies, performing an identity that has already been performed 1,000 times. The New Jersey operation becomes a kind of cultural cargo cult, copying the rituals and aesthetics, expecting the old power to materialize. That reading also aligns with the show's persistent undercutting of grandeur. The mythology is always being punctured. The family is always revealed to be a fragile bureaucracy staffed by insecure, damaged men. If Silvio looks like a mobster from Central Casting, perhaps that is because the characters themselves aspire to look like that. But even with that defense, the critique remains. For a series famous for deep, messy character arcs, Silvio is oddly underserved in the storyline department. Over 6 seasons, there is a legitimate complaint that he does not get a single major arc comparable to Paulie's neuroses, Christopher's addiction and ambition, Bobby's evolution, Ralph's monstrosity, Vito's trajectory, or Tony's ever-expanding crater of contradictions. The closest is his brief tenure as acting boss during Tony's coma, an episode of responsibility that does reveal something important. Silvio cannot handle the weight. The stress overwhelms him. The boss role does not elevate him, it destabilizes him. It is a rare moment where the steady man shows fragility, and it implies that his competence is, in part, role-dependent. He thrives as the number 2. He breaks under the obligation to be the one. There is also the Columbus subplot, which some cite as his only real storyline, though even that is often described as unconvincing or awkward. either because the character is not meant to carry that kind of emotional crusade, or because the portrayal leans into broadness at the wrong time. When he gets small subplots elsewhere, they can land as silly, an effect attributed to writing, acting, or both. And there is a frank assessment that his spouse's on-screen presence does not help. The performance does not elevate scenes, and the show, famously capable of turning domestic detail into narrative dynamite, does not seem eager to spend time there.
Yet, paradoxically, this lack of depth can be read as a feature rather than a flaw. One view holds that Silvio is compelling precisely because he feels almost inhuman, a robot mafioso, a man who seems to exist only in the back rooms of the Bing and Satrials, delivering dry observations and then committing violence with unnerving ease. The less the audience sees of him at home, breakfast, television, tenderness, the more he resembles a fixed symbol of the life Tony has chosen, a polished, ever-present reminder that the enterprise requires people who can switch from banter to murder without the inconvenience of emotional transition. In that reading, adding backstory would dilute the ominous effect. He is not meant to be relatable. He is meant to be an ever-available instrument of consequence. And the show does, admittedly, reward attentive viewers with Silvio's background line brilliance. He produces memorable remarks and facial reactions that become part of the series' texture. Quiet commentary that lands because it is restrained, timed well, and often delivered as if the absurdity of the room is beneath him. His reactions to Christopher's outbursts, the small glances exchanged during tense leadership moments, and the brief flashes of incredulity often do more to define him than any monologue could. The character can be meme-like without ever needing to wink at the audience, because the world itself is already absurd enough. That mean quality becomes a liability when the portrayal tips into parody, and nowhere is that more complained about than in The Many Saints of Newark. The discomfort is not subtle. The younger version is perceived as exaggerated to the point of sketch comedy, with hair and mannerisms pushed so far that it feels like an imitation of an imitation. Instead of younger Silvio, the result is described as Silvio turned up to 11, a performance that resembles a late-night comedy impression more than a grounded character. The broader criticism extends to the film's general approach. Characters rendered as caricatures of their original selves, as if the creative instruction was recognizable, not real. For a prequel trading heavily on nostalgia, the irony is sharp. In trying to replicate iconography, it loses credibility. There is also a recurring fascination with the hairpiece element, because the show itself makes it hard to ignore. Silvio's hair has long carried the aura of something engineered rather than grown, and that becomes a joke that practically writes itself when later depictions lean into it. It is the kind of detail that feels trivial until it becomes emblematic of the entire character. Constructed, curated, almost theatrical. Of course, calling Silvio a caricature invites an inconvenient counterexample. There have been real mobsters who dressed and behaved in exactly those heightened ways. Pomped hair, sharp clothes, expressive faces, a public persona built like a brand. In that sense, the stereotype critique can become its own kind of naivete, assuming reality must be subtle when reality often prefers spectacle. The deeper question is not whether such men exist, but whether this particular portrayal coheres with the show's evolving tone, and whether the writing ever trusted the character enough to let him exist beyond surface signals. The pilot episode complicates everything, as pilots often do. Messy, inconsistent, full of choices that later feel like they belong to a different show. There are claims about Silvio originally being conceived as a civilian associate rather than a made mobster, supported by trivia references, and met with the skepticism such sources typically earn. The pilot also contains broader inconsistencies, characters behaving with a recklessness that later seasons avoid, early relationships that fade, plot devices, like a girl's soccer obsession, that appear for one episode and then evaporate, and actions in public that would later be framed as intolerably risky. Some rationalize it as a function of the era, less surveillance, fewer cameras, Witnesses unlikely to testify against mob figures? Others offer the simplest explanation. It was the pilot, and pilots get a pass. The important takeaway is that early texture is not always authoritative. The series finds itself over time. The question of Silvio's flaw emerges naturally from this. Everyone else seems to have a glaring dysfunction, while Silvio appears comparatively stable. He has no obvious addiction spiral, no operatic insecurity bleeding into every conversation, no compulsive self-sabotage demanding a dedicated arc. One suggestion is sloth or lack of initiative, always involved, rarely driving. Another reading is that he is simply the normal one among criminals, a narrative control sample used to highlight how dysfunctional the others are. That interpretation is strengthened by the observation that the show tends to focus on people whose problems generate story. The ones who create chaos, make catastrophic choices, refuse growth, and then act surprised when consequences arrive. A stable home life and functional marriage do not produce the same weekly fireworks and thus remain largely off-screen. Still, stable is not healthy. There are pointed reminders that Silvio is a serial adulterer, so lust is hardly absent. He operates a business built on exploitation, laundering, and coercion, so the moral resume remains bleak. Some frame his vice as pride, a belief that being a man of honor entitles him to commit crimes, cover them up, and kill when necessary. Others treat him as comparatively less greedy than his peers, patient, rational, able to play the long game, which reads like virtue until it becomes obvious that it is simply a different strategy for extracting profit from suffering. He is not a good man, he is a well-organized criminal. One of the more persuasive analyses is that Silvio's undoing is not a single personal vice, but entrenchment, choosing, fully and comfortably, to embed himself in the mob life. He runs a front business, handles payroll and laundering details, and maintains the machinery that keeps the enterprise functioning. That makes him valuable, and therefore targetable. When war escalates, the myth that competence equals safety collapses. His failure is not a grand moral mistake. It is the practical mistake of underestimating urgency when enemies have already shifted from strategy to bullets. He is playing long-term operational chess while someone else is aiming at vital organs. The series, with its typical cruelty, turns the competent man's devotion to structure into the very circumstance that leaves him exposed. His brief experience as acting boss reinforces this. The man who appears unshakable as consigliere becomes visibly stressed when forced into the top role. There is commentary that he cannot handle the pressure, that he is physically overwhelmed, evacuated in a state of panic. It is a critical revelation. Silvio's calm is not an infinite resource. It is a product of being able to operate within boundaries he understands. Strip away the buffer and the strain shows. It also retroactively validates why he rarely takes initiative to move up. Perhaps it is not laziness. Perhaps it is self-knowledge. There are also small details that deepen him in ways the show never formalizes into an arc. His fastidiousness, his interest in cleaning and order, his meticulous habits. Those traits read as comedic until they become psychological. A man trying to impose control and cleanliness on a life built on contamination. The controlled demeanor, the tidy routines, the carefully maintained aesthetic, all of it can be seen as a coping mechanism, a way to domesticate chaos. And when chaos finally becomes unmanageable, the coping fails. The discussion of underutilization returns here with practical explanations. The performer was not primarily an actor. The role may not have been designed to demand the kind of heavy dramatic lifting carried by the show's top-tier cast. Touring schedules may have limited availability. Writers may have avoided centering episodes around a performer still developing range.
Whatever the reason, the result is the same. Silvio is often present as texture, counsel, and threat, rather than as a fully explored human being. Some regret this, especially when later seasons devote extensive time to other arcs that feel, to some, less essential. Others argue the restraint is artistically correct. Too much exposure would force the character to flip the switch too often, and the switch is more chilling when it is rare. The underutilization argument also applies elsewhere. Patsy, for instance, is cited as one of the most realistic wise guys, the kind of person who could hold a normal conversation and then, if ordered, carry out violence without hesitation. The idea is that realism often sits at the margins, because realism does not always generate spectacle. Yet the show's power is precisely that it can make marginal realism terrifying. Silvio's off-to-the-side presence, similarly, can be essential. He is the quiet evidence that the organization does not run on Tony's psychology alone. It runs on competent enablers who do not need to be the main character to do immense damage. Ultimately, the debate over Silvio reveals more about the standards being applied than about Silvio himself. If the standard is best mobster, as in most effective at preserving the enterprise, Silvio has a strong case. Stoic, loyal, measured, usually pragmatic, able to advise the boss without combusting. If the standard is best character, the critique that he lacks depth is fair. Fewer major arcs, fewer interior contradictions displayed, less personal life examined. If the standard is realism, opinions split. Some see an over-the-top caricature. Others see a deliberate commentary on mob myth performance. Still others point out that real criminals can be just as theatrical. And if the standard is morality, the entire contest collapses into the grim joke it always was. Grading predators by professionalism does not make them less predatory. So yes, Silvio can be admired as the composed consigliere who keeps feelings out of business, until he does not. He can be criticized as a stereotype in a tailor-made suit, until it becomes clear that the show's criminals often dress themselves in stereotypes because that is the only tradition they have left. He can be dismissed as flat, until his flatness starts to look like something scarier than complexity. The possibility that some people really do function as instruments, without the dramatic flourishes of a breakdown. He can be mocked as a walking meme, until he calmly commits acts that remind everyone what the jokes are built on. In a series that specializes in exposing the rot beneath performance, Silvio's greatest trick may be that he looks like pure performance and still manages to feel like an authentic part of the rot. Subscribe